Once upon a time, in a village called Amizu, there lived a man called Amechi. Amechi was the richest farmer in Amizu. He had three very large plots of land, which he inherited from his late father. He was an only son. Villagers often said that he was blessed by his chi, and that was why he prospered more than every other farmer in Amizu. Amechi had a wife named Udodi. She was a very beautiful woman and hardworking. She would always follow her husband to the farm, even on days that her husband would beg her not to worry. Amechi was rich, so he could afford to hire men to work on his farm. So most of the time, he just went to inspect what the workers were doing. After 5 years of marriage with Udodi and no pregnancy, Amechi became anxious. He was an only child of his parents and did not want his father's lineage to end. So, with his wife's permission, he married another wife. Her name was Okuka. Okuka was a troublemaker. As soon as she moved into Amechi's house, she started to make trouble with Udodi. She told Udodi that she didn't want to share her husband with her. She told Udodi that since she couldn't bear a child for Amechi, she should pack her things and return to her parents' house. She called Udodi useless, barren, and all sort of names. Udodi was a peace-loving person. Most times, she would ignore Okuka and go her way. Other times, when the mean words get to her, she would enter her chamber and cry. Amechi tried to warn Okuka. Each time he tried to caution her, she would threaten Amechi that she would pack her things and return to her father's house. Amechi was desperate and didn't want that, so oftentimes he will end up apologizing to her. 2 months after the marriage, Okuka was found to be with child. She became even more troublesome to Udodi. She would call her barren, call her a witch, and said she was eating up her children. She would throw things at her just to start up a fight, anything to make Amechi send Udodi away. Udodi would cry bitterly. She questioned the gods, Amechi and her chi. She started to emaciate because she wasn't eating. She would just cry all day. Amechi felt bad because of what his wife Udodi was going through. He tried to console and reassure her that all would be well. Not long after, Udodi was found to be with child too. Amechi couldn't hold back his joy. He begged Udodi to forgive him for not being patient with her and the gods. He promised that things would change. When Okuka found out that Udodi was with child too, she became bitter towards her husband and Udodi. She accused her husband of abandoning her and paying more attention to his wife. He continued to call Udodi names and said that Udodi was pretending to be pregnant and that time would tell. Months passed and Udodi gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Amechi named her Isioma. She was even more beautiful than her mother. 2 weeks later, Okuka gave birth to another beautiful baby girl. Amechi was over the moon. At last, his chi has blessed him with two beautiful daughters. His lineage would not end after all. He called her Chidouka. And so, Amechi and his wife Udodi tried to make peace with Okuka, but to no avail. Isioma and Chido became good friends and loved to do things together. But Okuka wouldn't allow that. She tried to sow seeds of discord, hate and strife and enmity in her daughter. Chidouka tried to resist. because she loved Isioma very much. She couldn't understand why her mother wanted her to hate and be mean to Udodi and her daughter. But as time went on, she began to follow in her mother's footsteps. Years passed, and the bond between the girls started to break. When the girls became 18 years, strange things started to happen. There was always one person or another complaining that something was missing. There was a thief living amongst them. Amechi suspected one of his daughters. Oftentimes, he would call them together to find out who the thief was, but no one was admitting anything, and so it continued. In no time, the villagers started to complain that things were missing from their houses. In Amizu, the punishment for stealing was death by stoning. So for decades and decades, stealing did not exist until now. The Igwe of Amizu called the elders to deliberate on the issue. A decision was reached, and the message was passed to the villagers through the town crier. The Igwe admonished that the thief living among them should caution him or herself. He admonished parents to caution their children because the culprit will not be spared. And so it went on. The stealing continued, and the villagers started to keep vigil to discover who the culprit was. One day, Udodi went into her room in search of her hair tie. She had looked everywhere for it, so she decided to check inside Isioma's basket of clothes. To her shock, she found a lot of items that did not belong to her daughter. She was heartbroken. So Isioma was the thief living in Amizu. She cried. She didn't understand why or how. Isioma was a very loving, obedient, hardworking, smart, and honest girl. Why would she become a petty thief? Her father loved her very much and gave her everything. When Isioma returned from the stream that day, Udodi confronted her. She admitted to her mother that she had been the one stealing all this time. She cried and begged her mother for forgiveness. She said she couldn't control the voices in her head, that any time before she stole, she would hear a voice calling her, commanding her to go and steal. She said that the urge was so strong, and sometimes she wouldn't even know how she got to a particular place or house. Her mother banned her from leaving her room. She told her she was not allowed to go out to anywhere except to take her bath and ease herself, and even then, she would be supervised. Udodi was afraid. She decided not to tell anyone, even her husband. She was afraid that someone else would hear of it and expose her daughter. So for weeks, Udodi and Isioma were never apart. One day, Udodi's friend Ugo came visiting. When she was ready to leave, Udodi bade her goodbye. Ugo insisted that Udodi should see her off. So she agreed. After all, Isioma was asleep and couldn't do any harm. She was only going to be away from the compound for a few minutes. Minutes later, she came back into her room and couldn't find Isioma. She went round the compound in search of her, but she couldn't find her daughter. She started to panic. Where could Isioma have gone to? She was only out for a few minutes. She decided to go out in search of her, but then decided to wait in case she did not go far. All of a sudden, Udodi started to hear people shouting, mocking, clapping, and calling thief, Onyoshi. Then the voices started to fade off. She panicked and ran out of the compound. She ran so fast, she almost fell twice. She ran into Ugo, her friend, who was on her way to her house to give her the news that Isioma had been caught stealing meat from Agomma's pot. Agomma was Okuka's only friend. She had caught Isioma and raised the alarm, which had attracted the villagers to her house. Udodi threw herself on the ground. She begged death to take her too. She could not stand the thought of her only daughter being stoned to death. Ugo tried to console her. She tried to talk her out of going to the Igwe's palace, where the mob had dragged Isioma to. She took Udodi home. When they got to the house, they found Amechi, who was weeping bitterly. Amechi could not understand why or how his beautiful, well-trained daughter could become a thief. Okuka and her daughter Chido mocked Amechi and Udodi and called them names. Ugo tried to console her friend. After a while, they started to hear people shouting. The voices grew louder. In no time, an angry mob gathered in Amechi's compound, led by a few elders. They told Amechi that her daughter had escaped, but that the youth had gone in search of her. They warned Amechi and his wife not to harbor Isioma or have anything to do with her, that if they did, his entire family would be ostracized. Days ran into weeks and months, and the whereabouts of Isioma was still not known. The villagers began to settle back into their normal lives, but nothing was the same in Amechi's household. Okuka and her daughter made the compound unbearable for Udodi, who had become a shadow of herself. Chidouka and her mother became the center of attention for Amechi. He had lost one daughter and was not prepared to lose the only child he had left. Almost a year later, Nemesis struck. Chidouka was getting ready to go out to meet her friends. She noticed that she couldn't find her lip balm, so she went into her mother's room to see if she could use her mother's own. She found one hidden inside one of her mother's wrappers. She laughed and concluded that her mother was hiding it because she didn't want to share with her. So she applied a little to her lips and left the room. She was almost out of the compound when she met her mother returning from the market. No, she said, carrying the basket from her mother. Immediately Okuka heard her daughter's voice. She screamed and grabbed her head. What is it, Ne? Chido asked. As Chido continued to speak, Okuka continued to scream. In no time, villagers gathered to find out what was going on. As long as Chido continued to talk, Okuka screamed. No one could control her or understand what was happening to her, so they took her to the Igwe's palace. Her hands and feet were bound because she had become violent. Not even her husband could control her. The oracle was consulted. The chief priest asked Okuka to confess. There, she confessed that she was responsible for what happened to Isioma, that she had visited a native doctor in her mother's village. She said that she was able to control Isioma using the balm which the native doctor had given to her. She said she was jealous of Udodi and her daughter and wanted to get them out of the way so that she and her daughter would inherit everything. She died minutes after the confession. The villagers were in shock. The Igwe apologized to Amechi and Udodi for everything they had been through. He promised not to rest until Isioma was found. A year passed and Isioma's whereabouts was still not known. Chidouka regretted her actions towards her stepmother and Isioma. She begged for forgiveness. Amechi and Udodi prayed every day for the return of their daughter. They weren't even certain if she was still alive. Then one day, two strangers, a young man and his mother walked into Amechi's compound. Behind them was Isioma. Chido was the first to see her. She screamed and ran to hug her long-lost sister. Amechi and Udodi were overjoyed. They thanked the woman and her son for bringing their daughter back home. The woman's name was Chidubem. Her son, Ifeanyi, had found Isioma lying unconscious in the forest where he had been to hunt. He had taken her back home to her mother. Her mother was a seer, and coming in contact with Isioma had revealed what the young woman had gone through. She had advised Isioma to live with them until Okuka was brought to justice. She and her son had grown to like Isioma. Ifeanyi asked for her hand in marriage. Amechi accepted. Months later, Isioma married the love of her life, and they lived happily ever after. Morals of the story: we should be patient and wait for God's time. Jealousy breeds hate, strife, and wickedness. Stealing is never rewarded, and it can result in serious repercussions. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Please don't forget to like, leave your comments down below. Let me know what you learned from the story. Share my video and subscribe, and I will see you in my next one.